The property sat at the end of a long gravel road in the dense pine-blanketed countryside of East Texas, a place so quiet that the sound of a car engine could be heard a mile away. For the better part of a decade, this had been the self-imposed exile of a man the world knew only through grainy news reports and the heavy title of American hero. To himself, he was just a ghost, trying to fade quietly into the landscape. He was a former Navy SEAL, a master-at-arms who had spent 20 years hurtling toward danger while the rest of the world ran from it. His body was a roadmap of operational scars, knees that ached with the humidity, a lower back that remembered the brutal shock of a hard landing on a night jump, and a constant low-level tinnitus that sang the soundtrack of 1,000 gun ranges and explosions in his ears. But the real wounds were the ones you couldn't see. The memories weren't stored away neatly. They were painted on the inside of his eyelids, the face of a young interpreter who took a round meant for him. The laughter of a team member, silenced forever by a IED blast that shook the earth miles away. The weight of a flag folded crisply and presented to a widow who collapsed into his arms. He had left the teams not with a parade, but with a stack of paperwork and a plane ticket home. The military had given him a pension, a diagnosis of severe PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and a firm handshake. They had sent him back to a world that felt alien. Society moved too fast, the noises were too sharp, and the faces of civilians concerned with traffic and television and taxes seemed like they belonged to a different species. Then he had tried the suburbs for a year. It was a disaster. The neighbor's dog barking at night would send him diving for cover behind the couch. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July put him in such a heightened state of hypervigilance that he didn't sleep for 3 days. So, he had retreated. He found the property through a real estate listing that described it as a hunter's paradise. It was a small, prefabricated metal home sitting on 50 acres of thick woods. There were no neighbors for a mile. The driveway was so long and winding that you couldn't see the house from the county road. It was perfect. It was a prison, but it was his prison. He installed heavy-duty blackout curtains so he wouldn't have to see the tree line at night, where his mind often placed potential threats. He stocked the pantry with months of food and water, a habit born of operational security that he couldn't break. He slept on a mattress on the floor in a corner of the living room, a spot that had no windows and only one line of sight to the front door. His only companion was a Belgian Malinois named Rig, a retired multi-purpose canine, MPC, he had adopted after the dog aged out of the program. Rig had served 3 tours in the sandbox, clearing buildings and finding IEDs. He was just as broken as his master. Shrapnel had cost him his hearing in one ear, and the years of stress had left him with a permanent limp. They were a perfect pair. They didn't need words. Rig would sense the nightmares before they even fully manifested, crawling onto the mattress and placing his heavy head on the man's chest to anchor him to reality. When the man's anxiety would spike in the grocery store, on the rare occasions he dared to go, Rig would press his body against his leg, a warm, solid presence blocking the world from getting too close. For 6 years, this was his life. He collected his mail once a week. He drove into town at dawn on Tuesdays to buy supplies, avoiding human contact. He read books, did push-ups until his arms gave out, and walked the perimeter of his property with Rig, checking for footprints or signs of intrusion, a security ritual he could not abandon. He wasn't living. He was just waiting. Waiting for the memories to fade, waiting for the anxiety to stop, waiting for... He didn't know what. He had accepted that this solitude was his only option. The world was a trigger, and he had successfully removed himself from it. Nay, it was an unseasonably cool October morning when the routine broke. The sun was just beginning to filter through the pines, casting long, ethereal shadows across the dew-soaked grass. The man was on his second cup of coffee, sitting in the dark of his living room, the faint glow of the television playing a news channel with the sound off. Rig, who had been dozing on his orthopedic bed by the door, suddenly lifted his head. His one good ear swiveled forward, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. The man was instantly alert. He muted the TV, his senses sharpening. He didn't move, just listened. He heard nothing. But Rig was up now, his hackles raised, limping toward the door. The dog didn't growl at nothing. The man slid a pistol from the holster attached to his side table and moved to the window, peeling back the edge of the blackout curtain a fraction of an inch. The front yard was empty. The tree line was still. He scanned for a full minute. Nothing. But Rig was insistent. He scratched at the door, a soft, anxious whine replacing the growl. This wasn't a threat response. This was something else. Concern. The man holstered his weapon, pulled on a pair of boots, and opened the door. Rig shot out, moving faster than his limp usually allowed, heading not toward the woods but toward the far edge of the property, near the fence line that bordered the rarely used service road. The man followed, his long stride eating up the distance. He called out to Rig, but the dog ignored him, disappearing into the tall grass that grew along the fence. By the time the man caught up, Rig was already there. He was standing over a crumpled form lying against the base of the old wooden fence. The man's heart, already elevated from the adrenaline, slammed against his ribs. It was a child, a girl. She looked to be about 10 or 11 years old. She was wearing a thin pink pajama top and shorts, both soaked through with dew and caked with mud. Her feet were bare and cut. Her face, smudged with dirt and tears, was deathly pale. Her lips were tinged with blue. For a moment, the seal froze. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't a combat medic scenario in a battalion aid station. This was a little girl dying on his fence line. The sight of her sent a shockwave through his system, a collision between his hyper-vigilant warrior mindset and a wave of raw, protective humanity he thought he had lost. Rig was already in action. He was gently licking the girl's face, his tail wagging slowly, a soft, encouraging sound coming from his throat. The girl stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of blue, but they were glassy and unfocused. She looked up at the massive dog and then at the man standing behind him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a bone-deep exhaustion and relief. "Help," she whispered, her voice a dry, raspy crack. "My mom. She won't wake up." The words hit the seal like a physical blow. The mission snapped into focus instantly. Years of training, of compartmentalizing fear and focusing on the objective, took over. He knelt in the mud beside her, his medical training flooding back. He checked her pulse, weak and thready but there. Her skin was cold to the touch. Probable hypothermia, dehydration, shock. "It's okay," he said. His voice a low, steady rumble that he hadn't used in years. It was the voice he used to calm frightened locals and wounded teammates. "You're safe now. My name is John. This is Rig. He's a good dog. He found you." The girl, whose name he would later learn was Lily, tried to speak again, but a shiver racked her small body. John knew he had to move. He couldn't carry her inside without risking further injury or heat loss. He stripped off his own heavy flannel shirt and wrapped it around her, the warmth of his body immediately beginning to combat the chill. He looked at Rig, who was now lying down, pressed against the girl's other side, providing a wall of warmth. "Guard," John commanded softly. Rig's head stayed up, his eyes watchful, but he didn't move. He was providing security and comfort. John sprinted back to the house, at his mind racing. He called 911, his voice calm and precise as he gave his location, something he never thought he'd do, and the situation. "Unresponsive female at a secondary location," he reported, slipping into the clinical language of the military. Juvenile female, approximately 10 years old, severe exposure in my care, possible adult female down, location unknown, need EMS immediately. He grabbed every blanket he owned, a first aid kit, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. He ran back to the fence line. Lily hadn't moved, but her eyes were still open, watching Rig. The dog was now licking her hand gently. John went to work. He started an IV from his old combat kit, a skill he hadn't used in a decade, getting fluid into her depleted system. He wrapped her in the blankets, creating a cocoon of warmth. As he worked, he talked to her in that same steady voice. "You're doing great, Lily. You're so brave. Just keep looking at Rig. He's a hero, you know. He found bombs in the war, but I think finding you is his most important mission." Lily looked at him, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Bombs?" she whispered. "Yeah," John said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He's a tough guy, just like you." He asked her questions gently, trying to keep her conscious. He learned she lived 5 miles down the service road. Her mom had been sick for a few days, really sick. Last night, she had stopped moving. Lily had waited all night, hungry and scared, and when the sun came up, she had decided she had to find help. She had walked for hours, following the fence line, until she couldn't walk anymore, and she had just sat down and gotten so cold and sleepy. At the sound of sirens in the distance was the sweetest music John had ever heard. But it also triggered a primal panic in him. Strangers, lights, noise. His sanctuary was about to be invaded by chaos. He felt his chest tightening, the old familiar vice of anxiety clamping down. He started to breathe faster. He looked toward the house, his mind screaming at him to retreat, to get back inside where it was safe. Then he felt a wet nose press into his hand. Rig had left Lily's side and was looking up at him, his brown eyes filled with an ancient, knowing wisdom. He gave a soft woof, then walked back to Lily and licked her face as if to say, "Focus. The mission isn't over. She needs you." John took a deep, shuddering breath. He anchored himself to the dog's presence. He looked at Lily. Not her eyes now closed, but her breathing steady under the blankets. The mission was to get this girl into the back of that ambulance. He could do that. He could hold it together for 5 more minutes. The paramedics, 2 young men who looked barely out of their teens, were shocked to find a grizzled, bearded man in a remote field kneeling next to a critically ill child and a wolf-like dog. John gave them a crisp, concise report. Vitals, fluids administered, estimated time of exposure. They loaded Lily onto a stretcher. As they lifted her, her eyes opened again. She looked around, panicked, until she saw John and Rig. "The dog," she mumbled. "The good dog." "You can come, sir," one of the paramedics said. "Ride with us." John hesitated. The ambulance was a metal box. Tight quarters, strangers, sirens. His mind recoiled. But Rig was already trying to jump into the back, his tail wagging. He wasn't leaving the girl. John nodded curtly and climbed in, Rig right behind him. The ambulance tore down his long gravel driveway, kicking up dust. John sat in the corner, his hand buried in Rig's fur, his eyes fixed on Lily's pale face. He didn't hear the sirens. He didn't see the flashing lights. He only saw the little girl, and he only felt the solid warmth of his dog. At the hospital, they were met by a flurry of activity. Lily was whisked away. John and Rig were left standing in the bright, harsh lights of the ER waiting room. A social worker approached him, asking questions. A deputy sheriff wanted a statement. The noise, the questions, the press of people, it all came crashing down on him. He felt the panic attack rising like a tidal wave. He started to back away, looking for an exit, his chest heaving. But before he could flee, a doctor appeared. He walked directly to John. "Sir, the little girl, Lily, she's asking for you, and for your dog." The request cut through the fog of his panic. He followed the doctor, Rig's nails clicking on the linoleum. They led him to a curtained-off bay. Lily was lying in a bed, hooked up to monitors, an IV in her arm. She looked small and fragile against the white pillows, but her cheeks had a hint of color. When she saw Rig, her face broke into a weak smile. Rig immediately went to the side of the bed and rested his head on the mattress, his tail thumping a happy rhythm against a cabinet. John stood awkwardly in the corner. Lily looked at him. "You saved me," she said. John shook his head, his throat tight. "No, Lily. And I just happened to be there. This guy," he said, nodding at Rig, "he's the one who found you. He wouldn't give up until I followed him." Later that night, after Lily's mother had been found and rushed to the same hospital, she was in critical condition from a severe diabetic episode, but would survive. John sat on a bench outside the hospital entrance. The cool night air felt good on his face. Rig was curled at his feet, asleep, exhausted from the day's drama. A nurse came out and handed him a cup of coffee. He thanked her, his voice quiet. He sat there for a long time, looking up at the stars, something he hadn't done in years without scanning for aircraft. The world was still loud. His mind was still a battlefield, but for the first time in 6 years, the silence didn't feel like a void. It felt like peace. He had left his sanctuary. It faced the chaos and helped someone. And he hadn't done it alone. He looked down at the sleeping dog, the retired warrior who had served his country and then served his master, and who had, on this day, led him back to the human race. The fence line that had been his barrier to the world had become a bridge, thanks to a dying girl and a dog who refused to let her go. And for the first time in a long time, John thought that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start living on the other side of it.